What are you doing? You're supposed to bring balance to the wait, didn't we already do this? We already did this. Yeah, the decks are pretty much the same as my video a couple days ago, except with like a few changes, but other than that, the only change is Priest is dead. I usually take some time to wait on my top 5 decks video, but number 1, as you can tell by the background, I am moving here pretty soon. And number 2, things really didn't change all too much with the balance patch outside of Overheal Priest being essentially deleted from the game and Big Spell Mage pretty much feeling the same. I mean, Big Spell Mage is just one of those decks where it has so much support around it. I don't think that changing the card to how it originally was is really going to make that much of a difference. Unfortunately, Big Spell Mage is still the best deck in Hearthstone. And we're just going to jump right into it. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to get the best meta analyses that Hearthstone has to offer, because I don't think anybody really goes into as much detail as I do. Because I'm going to give you guys the top 5 decks in Legend, 5 decks that I feel like are very easy to hit Legend, and then some of my favorite decks are some of the more goofy ideas that you definitely will not see anywhere else. But where you're going to see this next deck everywhere though. It's literally everywhere. No Hands Gamer has barely changed up his list to where he used to run an audio amplifier, but now he doesn't even run this anymore, and I don't really understand why it was in the deck. There's an MCT now. Don't really know what that's all about, but I'm not gonna sit here and say that, you know what, this deck could maybe be changed, maybe be optimized. The big thing about Big Spell Mage is that it is still playing Tsunamis on turn 5. I don't know what they're gonna do with this card, because it was so funny how this card, when it first came out, was completely, utterly unplayable. Garbage. One of the worst cards that we've ever seen. And now it is just absolutely ruling the meta, because you have Kelagos, you have Skyla, you have King Tide, you have Conniving Conman, you have Watercolor Artist. I know it's Watercolor Artist, but I keep calling him Water Cooler because I keep saying it on accident. And then you also have coins, and just there are so many ways of enabling the turn 5 Tsunami. It's just ridiculous. Marin even finds his way into this deck, even though he has been nerfed with the Wondrous Wand going to discount by 3 instead of discounting all the way to 0. Golden Kobold, pretty much there's no change here. There's no way people are going to choose this over the Wondrous Wand. But now in the situations where you do need to play Kobold, it does feel a little bit better. But yeah, Big Spell Mage doesn't feel any weaker and doesn't feel any slower, and literally just feels the same, even though this deck has been nerfed how many times now? Next up, we're talking about Pipsi Paladin, because Big Spell Mage and Pipsi Paladin are still the most successful decks that have actually maintained their strengths. But one thing that's a little bit different about the Pipsi Paladin is that we're no longer running the cube. I know, it didn't survive very long. We've taken out one other card, but I forget exactly what it is. But the new card that definitely should find its way into this deck is definitely Keeper Strength. Keeper Strength makes a lot of sense, and the main reason why a lot of people were not initially running this card is because in Pipsi Paladin, you really wanted your Holy Draw spells from your Hi-Ho Silverwing to be either Divine Brew or your Holy Glow Sticks. But since we are running the Renathal package and we are running a big deck, we want more ways of being able to clear, so running Keeper Strength does make a lot of sense to me. Now granted, you have one less Prismatic Beam, when originally this deck had 2 copies of Prismatic Beam, and I can't really see right off the top of my head what the new card is. Oh wait, it's Mixologist. Mixologist actually finds its way into this deck. So we've taken out the Cubicles, we've taken out a Prismatic Beam and some other card in order to fit in 2 copies of Mixologist and 2 copies of Keeper Strength in order to keep this deck alive. And there's just a lot of AoE that is now in this deck, because it used to be the only real AoE was Prismatic Beam and the Mixologist card. So Pipsi Paladin is looking like it is benefiting a lot from this balance patch, because Big Spell Mage is still one of the only decks that's really giving this archetype a bit of competition, but Pipsi Paladin is still so good that people are still running my original 30 of the list that I hit rank 1 legend with at the beginning of this season, because it's still just a good deck. So if you don't like Renathal, if you don't like the idea of adding in an extra 10 cards to make your combo deck a little less consistent, then I would still say that this version of the deck is absolutely fine. And before you guys even ask, yes, I believe Marin is still a fantastic card inclusion for the main idea that you're drawing cards and discounting, and most of the deck is like 3 mana or less anyway. So if you do happen to hit like a big card or something, like it's not going to be the end of the world. But Marin for card draw, I still like is completely fine in this version of the deck, to where if you don't want to change the pre-nerfed list, then you can still get away with playing it. Next up, we're going to be talking about Shaffar Rogue. Now, I do have to give this a little bit of a caveat, a little bit of an asterisk. This deck is still going under optimization, so I'm going to show you guys the 3 decks that I believe are the best versions of this deck. And the first one, you know, is the Amalgam deck that we've already made an entire video over, so go ahead and check out that video if you want to see the Amalgam in action. But pretty much the whole point of this deck is to use the Shaffar Spellburst and then proc it onto the Bargain Bin Buccaneer, so that way it has 1 copy of the Spellburst. You summon the copy from it, and now you have 2 minions that have the 1 Spellburst for 2 Spellbursts effectively. If you do that again and hit another Bargain Bin Buccaneer in your hand, suddenly the 2 ones are going to go on 1 of your Buccaneers with 2 Spellbursts, and then when you summon the copy of it, it will now have 2 copies of 2 Spellbursts, and you can continue to do this combo by breakdancing and shadow stepping the Bargain Bin Buccaneer, which will automatically trigger the Spellburst of the Buccaneers on the field. So yeah, it's a really interesting combo that is all in on trying to make the biggest minions possible, and when I say big minions, I mean like 27/27s by turn 5 big. This deck can get very large very quickly. Now, there's another version of the deck that I ended up playing a little bit last night on stream that goes all in on the same idea, except now we're running the South Sea deckhand as a way of actively closing out the game, to where if we get enough buffs from this card, we can easily just deal like upwards of like, I did like 50 damage with this deck, best case scenario. And I think, you know, as long as you keep shuffling the spell bursts over and over and over again, you could probably deal even more than 50. But the one thing that really sucks about the deckhand is the situations where the deckhand eats up the Shaffar, and you still have to play it normally as a tempo option, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but you always want to try and have the Shaffar hit the Buccaneer first, so that way you can start compounding as early as possible. You're not just utilizing a bunch of spells, and God forbid you have to use one of your bouncer options to keep the deckhand in hand. You do need to do this in order to keep the combo alive, but you usually want to save your break dances and your shadow steps so when you either have lethal with the deckhand, or if you're getting the value from the Buccaneer over and over again. But this is essentially the same list with a few changes, with like Tarslick being in the deck, for example. But in the next deck I want to show you guys, it's going all in on just making Shaffar as consistent as possible. So this is the latest version that Maxi was playing on their stream, and oh my god, he's trying to make mixtape work. I don't know what's going on here. In fact, I know exactly what's going on here. What is going on here is that he has literally 2 minions in the deck. We have Nexus Prince Shaffar and Bargain Bin Buccaneer. So that way you can keep your dig for treasure in your early turns and always play it on 1 with the hope of either getting a coin or you get the Shaffar immediately. And the way that you can continue the spell burst triggering over and over and over again is with cards like From the Scrap Heap and Mixtape. One hilarious thing about Mixtape is that this matchup, the mirror matchup, is so common at top 100 legend that Maxi literally decided to put in a mixtape in the situation to where your opponent plays the Shaffar before you do, so that way you can discover a copy from your opponent, play it, and then you could start doing the thing and not be last. That is absolutely hilarious in my opinion, and I don't know if this card is good, but that's the reason why it's in the deck, so at least it makes sense when you explain it outright. But yeah, the whole point of the deck is to still do the exact same thing with the Bargain Bin Buccaneer, but the issue is you do not have 2 copies of it, so you can't have like the spell burst compound as easily. This is more so just like getting the 2 spell bursts from the Buccaneer and then just keep trading it onto other minions. You still do have like a shadow step onto the Buccaneer after you've procced the spell burst, so you could potentially set up that compounding value again, but it's a little bit more difficult and requires a bit more setup depending on what exactly are the minions that you get from the scrap heaps, from your mixtape, and those are the only minion generators. So yeah, that is what this deck is trying to do. Whether or not you believe in this deck, I completely understand if you're apprehensive to it, but it is the next version of this deck that I plan on exploring. Next up, we have Egg Hunter. I don't know why this deck is that popular in all honesty. I think this is the deck that people are playing in order to somewhat be effective against Mage, because the one thing that really matters about the Big Spell Mage summoning 3 minions instead of 4 is that Hollow Hound now completely cleans up a Tsunami turn. So I feel like this is the deck that people are actively playing in order to try and counteract the Mage turns, but the one thing that really sucks about turn 5 Tsunami is that it still will usually win the game unless you have like Mystery Egg Yelling Yodeler value ready to just go on command. So this is just one of those decks that can definitely go the long distance if you have its setup turns, but its early game turns to sustain with like, you know, a Miracle Salesman into a 2-drop, into a Gorgon Zormo, into Mystery Egg, still feels very important to where if you don't hit that curve, it kind of just brings you back a little bit. Now, granted, the Mystery Egg is one of the most important parts of the deck, so that way you can get the big beasts and start, you know, chaining Hollow Hounds, Muklas, Sasquatches, or King Plushes, but the early game tempo of this deck is very important because if you don't maintain before turn 4, you will just get beaten down, and you have 30 life versus 40 life, and decks are literally sustaining themselves to be good against 40 HP decks, so 30 HP decks are a lot easier now. So yeah, Egg Hunter, it's still a very effective deck, but unfortunately this is gonna feel one of those types of decks where it does its thing really well, and then the next game you almost automatically lose because you just didn't draw your cards. It is very dependent on its card draw, so that's why keeping cards like Tracking, for example, or a Bird Watching is going to be very crucial for you to do well with this kind of deck. Here are some fun Shaffar decks that I was looking up for, a little bit of a teaser for the future, but let's go ahead and take a look at the meta according to HS Guru, because oh my lord, Nostalgia Shaman, Aggro Paladin, or Big Spell Mage, Evolve Shaman, Zarimi Priest, Pipsi Paladin, the decks that you would expect to see are definitely up here, and Big Spell Mage being 13% of the meta, even at Diamond through Legend, really does say a lot. Gaia Paladin making itself as the most popular deck in the format at the Diamond through Legend rank, I feel like is very interesting. But the moment that you start going up the ladder, so to speak, at top 10k, Shaman decks become, you know, king because they're really good against Mage and Pipsi Paladin, the only really decks that people are playing at top Legend with great success. Egg Hunter finding some good stats, but I feel like it just isn't that popular yet. Gaia Paladin, again, the most popular deck in the game, but Big Spell Mage is still the deck that I feel like a lot of people are very frustrated with. And then when we go on to the top 1000, Big Spell Mage, Nostalgia Shaman, Mystery Egg Hunter, Gaia Paladin, Shaffar Rogue, somehow Highlander Warrior, I don't understand. And then 10% of people playing Alonius Druid is like one of the safer decks that really didn't get that much impacted by the meta outside of Dorian. But it's still a deck that I feel like people just don't play well, even though it's got a high popularity, its win rate is not entirely there. And then when you take a look at the meta on HSReplay, Diamond through Legend, again, Shaman, Big Spell Mage, Shaman, Pain Warlock, Earthen Paladin, Pirate Demon Hunter, all of the decks that you would expect that we've been talking about for the past week and a half, 2 weeks are still the exact same decks that are sticking around with a few inclusions of like Highlander decks, which you could find good Highlander decks. I'll go ahead and use this part of the video in order to say that Highlander Shaman is actually not that bad because it's a tempo-based deck. But the issue with most Highlander decks right now is that they're also running Renathal. And Renathal Highlander, it's bad. It's just bad. The reason it's bad is because you have 40 cards now in your deck, and maybe 2 of them are good. It's just not a consistent thing, and you'll see this in the data coming up ahead. But yeah, Highlander Death Knight, for example, Highlander Druid barely cracking a 50%, Highlander Priest 45%, Highlander Warrior 40%. I swear to God, guys, this isn't just me being a hater about Reno or Renathal. Renathal Reno decks are inconsistent, and it's the very first idea that people come to whenever they thought about Renathal. So these decks are lingering because people are experimenting with them and having fun with them, not because they're good. If you want to have fun with them, be my guest, but I'm not going to be gaslit being told that Highlander Renathal decks are actually good in Hearthstone, because they're not. So now that we've talked about the meta, let's actually talk about the top 5 decks that I would recommend to try and hit Legend if you are not there yet. Because again, Shaman is king. I feel like if you want to hit Legend right now, you just put your faith in Thrall and the boys, because Razzle Dazzler is still a pretty decent card. People are going back to playing Wave of Nostalgia, so that way you can play like Sigil of Skydiving. And I feel like the reason why people are going back to the Wave is so that way you can have like a pre-nerfed Razzle Dazzler-like board to where on turn 5, turn 6, you can just play the Wave and have essentially the same threat that Razzle Dazzler initially, you know, presented. But now that Razzle Dazzler is a 7-mana card, we have to fill out the deck a little bit more meaningfully. We have a Molten Magma as an easy fire card. But yeah, it just makes sense with the way that this deck is built, because with Razzle Dazzler in particular, you don't really need that much value from it. If you have 2 Spell School cards that you've played, you're already summoning, you know, an additional 3 minions from the Razzle Dazzler. So it's just like, it's just one of those decks to where it plays a board. It doesn't need the biggest board because it is always threatening lethal with the Bloodlust that is available from Thrall's Gift. And honestly, I feel like you'll notice this a lot, especially if you're trying to hit Legend. people at those ranks don't play around Bloodlust that frequently. Like, there will be moments that they will, but they're mostly just trying to outboard you and then have a larger, you know, amount of stats than you do. But if you stick a board and you know, have a Bloodlust out, always be paying attention to this, because I feel like, especially at the lower ranks, this is going to be your most consistent win condition. And next up is almost the exact same deck, except it is trying to do a little bit more with the Razzle Dazzler, because we have Skirting Death in the deck. And I'm more so just showing you guys two different lists right now, because the thing that's really weird to me, and the thing that keeps confusing me every single time I look at decks, is that I thought Rainbow Shaman was the version of Shaman that didn't run Rave of Nostalgia, and now there is, like, on HS Guru and on HSReplay, there's Wave Shaman, there's Rainbow Shaman, and then there's Evolve Shaman, which are all extremely similar. Now, granted, Evolve Shaman is usually, you know, big Shaman with, like, evolving, like, a Kologarn or something like that, but this is essentially almost the exact same deck, and I just wanted to show you guys just how similar some of these archetypes really can be, even though they're going to be listed as a completely different archetype on HSReplay. But yeah, this deck is still absolutely fine. Shaman is king right now if you want to hit Legend, and it feels like one of the most consistent ways of being able to punish Mage, as long as you have a lot of tokens and able to threaten lethal with a Bloodlust. Now, up next really goes to show you guys how hard I'm trying to find new decks in these videos, because I don't want to just make another top 5 deck video being like, oh man, the meta didn't change, but this is really what's happening right now. And Elemental Shaman is actually a deck that is popping up in the Diamond through Legend ranks as a very consistent deck to hit Legend with. Now, the list that I originally saw had taken out a Giant and a Saloon Brewmaster for a Tar Slime, and honestly, I'm just not a fan of this card in the deck in particular, so I would rather you guys just stick with the Giant and stick with the Saloon Brewmaster, because it just makes the most amount of sense in this particular deck to have like a double Lamplighter turn as a possible lethal setup, or you could even, like, you know, Lamplighter into Saloon Brewmaster and then double Lamplighter by turn 8 as a way of meaningfully ending the game. And I feel like elemental decks, especially Shaman and Mage, are going to get so much better with these new cards, so I feel like if you're into this archetype, play it now, and then when the new cards come out, this deck is going to go under some immense changes, dude. I really feel like there are going to be some insane elemental cards that are available for Shaman, because in Mage, we've already seen what they're able to do, and they got some insane fire support cards. Imagine what they're going to do with Shaman, because Elemental Shaman and Elemental Mage seem to be the two big elemental classes, so yeah, keep a lookout. There's going to be some really weird Shaman cards. And next up, we have XL Pain Warlock. Why is the Hearthstone community doing this to themselves? People realize the main win condition of Pain Warlock is to play your big payoff cards like Molten Giant and Imprisoned Horror, right? Like, granted, Warlock does have a lot of card draw, but I feel like this is just a deck that people are putting together for the sake of putting Renathal into any deck. Like, maybe the idea that people have is that if I have an extra 10 life, it's a little bit easier for me to throw out Molten Giant at 18 life instead of at 8 life, which I kind of get. Except you're an aggro deck and you're just trying to throw out everything as quickly as possible, and there's not a lot of decks that are going to deal 8 to you except maybe like some other aggressive decks. So it's like, I really don't understand the thought process that goes into this, because it makes sense when you put it out on paper. But then when you think about it a little bit longer, I feel like it's just extremely inconsistent, because the cards that really make this deck sing are very important to have on curve. And especially now that Party Fiend is now a 2-mana card, the only good 1-drop turn that you have that actually sustains any real threats is your Flame Imp on 1. So you're pretty much making it to where if you don't have this card exactly by turn 1, you're automatically foregoing tempo, and I just really don't like that about the deck. Now, maybe a Party Fiend was still a 1-mana card, I could still kind of understand this, because you really would just want to have those turn 1 turns. Flame Imp, mass production, I would rather not play Demonic Studies on turn 1, but the tempo of this deck is very important, to where if you do miss a turn, you do still have, you know, like Party Fiend, you still have like a Geode and to set up like a Cursed Souvenir or something. But if you're not playing Malefic Rook on 3, and if you're not like setting up like some kind of like meaningful threat by turn 4 and like actually making it to where the Giants and the Horrors are playable, I'm not really sold on this deck. if you're gonna play Pain Warlock, I feel like the way to play Pain Warlock is just to play the deck, but the thing we gotta realize is that they are really trying their hardest in order to change this deck's play rate and to change just how frequently it scams. Because let's be honest, having a Molten Giant come out as early as turn 3 is really not captivating gameplay when it just automatically wins, and Pain Warlock has always been in this weird situation of like barely unplayable and barely tier 1. If you guys have been around for a while, you know exactly what I'm talking about, to where it seems like this deck either is really good and everyone is playing it, or it's really bad and no one is playing it. But I'm just gonna say this. If you want to play Pain Warlock, don't play the XL version. I just don't really see the value in it. You can try it, but if you're gonna break your back crafting cards for it, would not recommend it. And next up is Mech Rogue, and the only reason why I'm even talking about this deck is because one of my friends that came back to Hearthstone this month is currently sitting at the top 50 legend ranks by exclusively playing Mech Rogue and Pirate Demon Hunter. Even after the update, he's still only playing these decks and he's still having success with them. So I really don't know what's going on here on whether or not this deck is just, you know, a good way of scamming the Renathal decks because it's Mech Rogue. You have Wind Fury capabilities and insane damage outputs that, let's be honest, like if your opponent's not dealing with an Event-O-Matic, you know, by turn 4 and turn 5, they're just gonna lose the game even if they're at 40 life. So yeah, this is just one of those decks to where it feels like it's always a deck that people choose not to play because they're bored of it. But if you're just trying to hit Legend and you want an easier, you know, a simpler deck in order to do it with, this is still a very powerful archetype that I would recommend in order to hit Legend. And I'm not gonna spend that much time talking about this deck, but I found the good version of it. This is the version of the deck that I was telling you guys about, the version with the 1 hot coals. Again, my friend who's currently climbing at top 50 legend because he's just trying to get the highest rank possible, he's playing this version of the deck and is still having success with it. I don't know either, dude. The Pirate Demon Hunter feels like the most consistent aggro deck that's out there right now, to where whenever I go up against it, I'm always worried that they're gonna kill me as quickly as possible. But whenever I'm playing this deck, it just doesn't feel that good. And especially now with Treasure Distributor going to its original state and now not giving the extra pirates you summon +1 attack, or not giving himself +1 attack, like it just, I don't know, dude. Pirate decks have always felt like they're either extremely weak or extremely strong, and there is no in-between. But I wonder if it's just because it's either you love the deck or you hate it, because pirates, yeah, they're pirates at the end of the day. But if you want an easy Unga Bunga deck that is just focusing on getting quick wins and denying your opponent from being able to really play the Hearthstone game, then you could still get away with playing Pirate Demon Hunter. And the last deck that we're going to be looking at as a suggestion to go from Diamond to Legend is going to be Dungar Druid for one simple reason. You play the ramp and then you play the Dungar. It's really that simple. But another reason why I wanted to showcase this deck in particular is because there is 1 or 2 major changes that have happened in this balance patch that really affects this deck in particular. And that is the change to Dorian as well as Yogg-Saron. So first let's talk about Dorian and the only reason why this card got nerfed. Oaken Summons. It's the only reason why. Druid has been abusing Dorian so much to the point where these neutral cards are literally getting the Druid tax, as I like to put them, because they're just the best in Druid, and it's just really sad that Dorian really only saw play in like maybe Rogue as well. Every other class that has tried to utilize this Dorian has just been way too slow and just doesn't have the card draw in order to support it. While Druid, they've done everything with this card and they can still utilize it. That just goes to show how good neutral legendaries can be in Druid, to where in 4 mana in most classes, they never want to touch it, but because you have ramp and card draw being the most consistent things Druid can do, you want this Dorian, so you want the mana cheat possibilities that come from it. And Yogg-Saron is actually another great example about how, you know, this card was amazing at 9 mana for most classes, but this card going from 9 mana to 10 mana in Druid literally makes almost no difference in most games, except in situations to where you don't immediately ramp to 10. There are a couple of times to where Druids have died because they don't have the Yogg available for 9, but the point that I'm trying to make is that Druid usually ramps up its mana crystals so quickly and so effectively that even at 10 mana, Yogg is still absolutely completely fine in Druid. Now, there might be some other classes that don't really want to run a 10 mana Yogg, but the main reason why they're nerfing this is because of starships, and you don't just want your starship to be taken by every single Druid that is going to be in the meta. So yeah, Yogg definitely need to get nerfed for that reason, but Dungar Druid is still a very simple and effective deck to where you literally just want to ramp up as quickly as possible, play the Dungar, figure out what has happened afterwards with cards like Factory Assembly, Bot, Marin, as well as like Zilliax in order to threaten lethal of some kind or threaten by removing the board. Because usually if you just have this gigantic Dungar turn happen by turn 5, it is just going to win the game. Now, with the Oaken Summons being replaced, we have now put in an Amplified Elec as another Festival of Legends card that finds its way into this deck. Dog, do you have to do this right here? Sorry, Xena is under the desk right now, and she just wants to show you guys that she cares about these decks as well. But Amplified Elec has become the inclusion over Oaken Summons, because now it is just another big card and an AoE that can be very effective at effectively stopping your opponent dead in their tracks. They got nothing they can do when the Dungar hits the field. And now we're going to talk about the fun decks of the meta, and I have to say, this was the most difficult time that I had trying to find fun decks to where I literally had to make a deck. That's how bad this is getting right now. Because there's not a lot of people that are experimenting with the Shaffar, for example, to where the first deck I'm going to show you is the Freebird Hunter that was available in my previous video, but because I feel like I didn't get a lot of views, I wanted to utilize this version of the deck again to show you that you can have fun if you try hard enough, because this deck is all about generating a bunch of Freebirds, either by drawing them off of Dorian, which it really sucks that this deck got hit because of this, but you have Mystery Egg to hit the Freebird for 0 mana, to where if you have 3 of them in hand, you can play Hodir into Freebird 3 times. You have an 8/8 Freebird, then a 9/9 Freebird, and then a 10/10 Freebird to deal about 28 damage. So if you can just stack a hero power on top of that, that is exactly 30. There's also copies of Death Roll in the deck in order to try to help you against like decks that have like a really big minion that come out of nowhere. And against like the Shaffar Rogues, for example, if you could Death Roll a 24 or 27, that is just extremely funny. Now, I don't think that this is the best version of the deck, but this is one version that someone in my stream in particular has been crafting and has been meticulously messing with. So in his opinion, this is the best way of popping off this particular meme with Freebird and Hunter. And if you want to start having fun in Hearthstone again, give this deck a try. You'll have a little bit of fun. At least try it against your friends, I would recommend. Next up is another deck that I featured in my previous video, but I want to give this deck another shout out because it's got a really cool idea behind it. It is trying to use the Nexus Prince Shaffar in Death Knight, but in Death Knight, we already have a lot of hand buff stuff, so we're pretty much making a 40 HP, 40 card deck that is trying to utilize almost every single hand buff mechanic in Death Knight. So we have Death Growl in order to swap over the +2/+2 Death Rattle onto as many minions as possible. You have Eliza Goreblade as giving all your minions +1 attack. You have Blood Tap, you have Lesser Spellstone. You have every single card that buffs cards in your hand in this deck. Now granted, it has a little bit of inconsistency with card draw, so you need to have your Chillfallen Baron and your Acolyte of Death in order to cycle through the deck, to where if you can have Mining Casualties into Acolyte of Death by turn 3, that is probably the best thing that you can do, because the thing that you still want to do every single time with this deck is to play Puppeteer on 5, and then potentially play 1 mana Puppeteer into Yelling Yodeler by turn 6, or later on in the game as you draw more undeads, so that way you can buff later undeads that you happen to draw. Sorry, whenever I think of a tribe deck, I immediately think of elemental decks, but undead decks seem to be doing kind of good to where this deck has a somewhat decent win rate, but there might be another version of this deck that you should try. So I decided, why not make a 30 card version of this deck, because it feels like a deck with this kind of card draw is very dependent on hitting very specific turns. So we still have the Amateur Puppeteer to give all of the buffs. We still have the Nexus Prince Shaffar. We have 1 copy of Death Growl and 1 copy of the Spellstone, while the rest of the deck is just trying to use all of the good minions that give us some sort of ridiculous value. With the Buccaneer giving our minions Reborn, Dreadhound Handler being the best card in the deck, keeping the copy cards like Shattering Zombie Tank, card draw from the Baron, healing from the Seamstress, random generation from the Geist, and then of course we're going to run our Storm Guards to have as much Shaffar value as physically possible. Now the issue with a deck like this We really don't run a lot of spells, so having cards like Miracle Salesman actually makes sense in order to get the Snake Oil, so that way by turn 4, if we don't have the coin, we can play Shaffar into the 1 mana spell, into the 1 mana tradable card. Now granted, this isn't a great idea, and when I say it out loud, it sounds terrible because it is a bad idea, but it's a fun idea and one of the only ways that I can think of to try and make Shaffar work and not Rogue. And continuing on the trend of Shaffar decks, I have to say, it's sad. Looking at Shaffar is very similar to looking at Dungar, to where Dungar just goes in Druid very obviously, and every other class is like, how do I fit this into a deck? And there are a lot of people that are trying to fit Shaffar and Hunter in particular, and I'm not really sure why. I think the reason may be because they have a lot of like 1 mana cards and like 1 mana token generators, to where like if I play Shaffar into like Tremors, for example, then suddenly I'm gonna have a 6/4 Tremor with the spell burst, and that seems pretty decent, right? Well, this deck also runs Azernite Chain Game, which is pretty telling on how, you know, limited Hunter is on trying to make an archetype like this work. But Shaffar, outside of Rogue, the only other deck that people are exploring on HS Guru in particular is some sort of Shaffar Hunter, and before you ask, almost every single one of them have about like a 40% win rate or worse. So this deck is not really going to be that good, but if you want to try and utilize the Shaffar in something that's not Rogue or not in that Death Knight that I just showed you, then this is pretty much gonna be one of your only options, and that's kind of sad in my opinion. And the last deck that we'll talk about is Incindius Rogue. That's right, people are still playing Incindius Rogue, and we've already had an entire deck guide explaining this particular video. So if you want to have some better, you know, mulligan tips when it comes to Incindius, go ahead and check out that video. But the main idea of this deck is to try and play the Incindius, shadow step it so that way it costs 4 mana. So that way when you play your 1 mana Scoundrel and your Sonya combinations, you can play Incindius for 1 mana, get an extra copy from the Sonya, and then play 3 total Incindiuses, shuffling 15 eruptions into the deck. And then at the end of your turn, you have 2 Incindiuses on the field that can potentially buff them by +2 or +3. So that way your things are doing a lot of damage. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you also have cover artists in the deck, to where if you want to do like a Sonya cover artist combo, you can still do this with like Valira's Gift and make, you know, the big weapon that this deck is known for. You still have that scam as like your main win condition, your final win condition. But there's also, you know, you play Incindius, you have Sonya into 1 mana Scoundrel into cover artist onto the Incindius. So that way, if you can play another Incindius from your hand for 0 mana with the board if you have the board space, then you can have your Incindiuses buff your eruptions by +3, to where they are now dealing 4 damage, and that is just absolutely massive in a deck like this, because you are also actively drawing out your deck before you do this combo. So once you set up the Incindius combo, your opponent is probably gonna die going into the next turn. But this is definitely a bit of a meme deck, but I had some pretty decent success when I was playing this deck at top 200 Legend. Granted, it is a little bit of a hard deck to make work because there are a lot of moving pieces in this particular deck. But yeah, you have Pit Stop in order to draw your robocallers consistently, so you can have that card draw to kind of build up the combo. You want to play your Scoundrel as quickly as possible in order to enable the Sonya combos, but you've also got Grifta, Valira's Gift, as well as the Incindius as very real win conditions in order to pop off in one way or another, thanks to the Grifta and thanks to the Scoundrel. And just in case you need to have like an early game scam, you've also got Everything Must Go combos as like a way of like cheating the game by turn 3 through turn 5. So there's a lot that this deck can do, but you really need to be familiar with its win conditions before you start playing it. But there you guys have it. Those are my top 5 decks in Legend to hit Legend, as well as some 5 interesting archetypes that might help you have fun in Hearthstone again. And this is going to be the last top 5 deck in this apartment. Thank God. I am finally moving out of here. As you can tell by all the stuff, you know, around me, I am actively packing my stuff and ready to leave. The only thing that's really going to be staying is the carpet and the stuff behind me, because I want some decoration to, you know, make things a little bit cool. But yeah, we're moving very soon. I have a new house I can't wait to show you that we'll be posting pictures pretty soon. So thank you so much for making it to the end of this top 5 deck video, the last one in this apartment, and we will see you on the other side, in another house, in another time, in another planet, in another world, because oh my God, am I ready to be out of here? We'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.